Good evening. Picture this. You're walking through the streets of Rome in the year 64 AD. The air is thick with smoke that never quite clears. And when the wind shifts, you catch the acrid smell of charred wood and something else. Something you don't want to identify. Citizens hurry past with their heads down, speaking only in whispers when they think no one is listening. Above you, on the Palatine Hill, a massive palace glitters with gold and marble, its windows blazing with light, even as the city below struggles to rebuild from the ashes. This is Rome under Nero, a city where the emperor might decide your fate based on how you applauded his latest theatrical performance, where being too wealthy could get you executed for treason, but being too poor meant you were expendable entertainment for the masses, where the man who claimed to be the voice of Apollo also happened to be the most dangerous person in the known world. Tonight, we're diving deep into the twisted psyche of Emperor Nero, the man who turned paranoia into an art form and made cruelty his greatest performance. We'll explore how a spoiled teenager became the most feared ruler in Roman history, why his own people whispered that he was the Antichrist, and how he managed to make himself so thoroughly despised that even today, 2,000 years later, his name is synonymous with tyranny and madness. We'll uncover the blood-soaked path he carved to absolute power, the spectacular excesses that drained Rome's treasury, and the paranoid delusions that turned his reign into a nightmare for everyone around him. From matricide to mass murder, from artistic pretensions to architectural megalomania, this is the story of how Nero became not just a bad emperor, but a cautionary tale that still haunts us today. Drop a comment telling me what corner of the empire you're watching from and whether it's night or day in your kingdom. And subscribe, because, unlike Nero, I won't have you thrown to the lions if you forget to hit that notification bell. Chapter 1. The Making of a Monster. Every tyrant starts somewhere, and Nero's origin story reads like a dark fairy tale, written by someone with severe daddy issues and an unlimited budget for revenge. Born Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus in 37 AD, the future emperor entered the world already marked by violence and ambition. His father, Gnaeus Domitius Ahenobarbus, was a chariot racer turned politician with a reputation for cruelty that made even Romans uncomfortable. When someone asked Gnaeus what kind of child he hoped to have, he allegedly replied that any offspring of his and his wife would be abominable and a public disaster. Congratulations, Dad, you called that one perfectly. But even before Nero drew his first breath, his family tree was already soaked in blood. The Domiti Ahenobarbi were known for their red beards, their violent tempers, and their complete inability to play well with others. Nero's great-great-grandfather had been so notoriously cruel that he was remembered centuries later for his creative methods of torturing slaves. His great-grandfather had murdered a freedman simply for refusing to drink as much wine as he demanded. Violence wasn't just in the family genes, it was practically the family business. And then there was the maternal side. Agrippina the Younger came from the imperial family, but calling her bloodline distinguished is like calling a pack of wolves social animals. Her father was Germanicus, a popular general who died under suspicious circumstances, possibly poisoned by the Emperor Tiberius. Her brother was Caligula, whose 4-year reign of terror made him so hated that the Praetorian Guard assassinated him in broad daylight. Her other brothers had been exiled or executed for various conspiracies against the imperial throne. Family dinners in the Julio-Claudian household must have been like playing Russian roulette with poisoned wine. Nero's birth itself was an omen of the chaos to come. Ancient sources claim that when Agrippina went into labor, she consulted astrologers about the timing. They warned her that if the child was born at noon, he would grow up to kill his mother. Her response was chilling in its foreshadowing. Let him kill me, as long as he rules. It was like signing her own death warrant while simultaneously applying for the position of emperor's mother. The infant who would become one of history's most notorious tyrants entered the world feet first. a breech birth that Romans considered deeply unlucky. Midwives whispered that children born this way were destined to bring misfortune to their families. Given what would happen to Nero's relatives over the next few decades, those midwives turned out to be remarkably prophetic. But it was Nero's mother, Agrippina the Younger, who truly shaped him into the monster he became. If ambition were a disease, Agrippina would have been patient zero. She was the great-granddaughter of Augustus, which in Roman terms meant she had imperial blood and the ruthless cunning to use it. After Nero's father died when the boy was just 3, Agrippina set her sights on the ultimate prize, getting her son on the throne. To understand Agrippina's influence on young Nero, you have to understand the world she inhabited. Roman aristocratic women lived in a society that officially denied them political power, while unofficially making them the puppet masters behind every major decision. They couldn't hold office, command armies, or speak in the Senate, but they could poison rivals, arrange strategic marriages, and manipulate their male relatives into doing their bidding. Agrippina had mastered these shadow arts to a degree that would have impressed Machiavelli. She began grooming Nero for power from the moment he could walk. While other children played with toys, Nero was taught to command servants. While his peers learnt their letters, he was studying the art of political manipulation. Agrippina filled his head with stories of his divine ancestry, his destined greatness, and the enemies who would try to prevent him from claiming his rightful throne. She created a miniature emperor in training, complete with all the entitlement and none of the wisdom that such power required. The young Nero showed early signs of the cruelty that would define his reign. He tortured insects, pulling off their wings and watching them struggle. He enjoyed frightening smaller children and took particular pleasure in their tears. When his tutor tried to correct these behaviors, Agrippina intervened, explaining that future emperors needed to be strong, not soft. She turned every act of childhood sadism into a lesson in imperial necessity. Her first step toward real power was strategic remarriage. In 49 AD, she married her own uncle, Emperor Claudius, in what might be the most successful example of keeping it in the family in human history. This wasn't some romantic love story. This was a hostile takeover disguised as a wedding. Agrippina didn't just want to be empress. She wanted to be the mother of the next emperor. The marriage itself was a masterpiece of manipulation. Claudius was a scholar, more interested in history and engineering than the dirty business of politics. He was also lonely, having recently lost his previous wife to execution for adultery and treason. Agrippina presented herself as the perfect solution, a woman of impeccable imperial lineage who could provide both companionship and political wisdom. What she didn't mention was that her idea of political wisdom involved a lot of poison and strategic assassinations. Once she became empress, Agrippina moved quickly to secure her position. She eliminated rivals with the efficiency of a professional exterminator. Messalina's remaining allies found themselves facing sudden charges of treason. Claudius's advisors, who had opposed the marriage, suffered mysterious accidents or sudden illnesses. Even servants, who had shown insufficient enthusiasm for the new empress, discovered that their employment had become hazardous to their health. Claudius already had a son, Britannicus, who was the rightful heir, but Agrippina had plans for that little problem. She convinced Claudius to adopt 12-year-old Nero, making him part of the imperial family and, more importantly, older than Britannicus in the line of succession. It was like convincing someone to adopt a wolf pup and then acting surprised when it ate the family dog. The adoption ceremony was a triumph of political theatre. Nero, renamed Nero Claudius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, stood before the Roman Senate and delivered a speech that Agrippina had spent months perfecting. He spoke of his gratitude to Claudius, his dedication to Roman glory, and his determination to prove worthy of imperial favor. The senators applauded enthusiastically, partly because they were genuinely impressed by the boy's poise, and partly because they were terrified of what would happen if they didn't show sufficient enthusiasm for Agrippina's pet project. The young Nero, now officially named Nero Claudius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, was given the finest education Rome could offer. His tutor was Seneca, one of the greatest philosophers of the age, a man who believed in virtue, wisdom, and the dignity of human life. The irony was apparently lost on everyone involved. It's like hiring Gandhi to teach a masterclass in world domination. Seneca genuinely tried to instill moral principles in his young charge. He taught Nero about the responsibilities of leadership, the importance of justice, and the philosophical foundations of good governance. He assigned readings from the great Stoic philosophers, hoping to develop the boy's character alongside his intellect. He organized discussions about ethics and virtue, attempting to create a philosopher-emperor who would rule through wisdom rather than force. The problem was that Nero treated these lessons like a game. He learned to mouth the right words about virtue and justice, while privately planning acts of spectacular cruelty. He could deliver eloquent speeches about the dignity of human life, while casually ordering the execution of anyone who annoyed him. Seneca had created a monster with perfect rhetorical skills, a tyrant who could justify any atrocity with beautiful philosophical language. Under Seneca's guidance, Nero showed early promise in rhetoric and the arts. He had a natural talent for performance and an almost supernatural ability to command attention. But even his tutor noticed something unsettling about the boy. Seneca later wrote that Nero had a cruel nature that needed to be carefully managed. This should have been a red flag the size of the Roman Forum, but instead, everyone just nodded and continued grooming him for power. The teenage Nero's education extended far beyond philosophy and rhetoric. Agrippina ensured that he learned the practical arts of imperial rule, how to read military reports, how to evaluate provincial governors, how to manage the complex financial systems that kept the empire running. But she also taught him more sinister lessons: how to identify potential threats, how to eliminate rivals without leaving evidence, and how to use fear as a tool of governance. Perhaps most importantly, she taught him that normal human emotions were weaknesses that emperors couldn't afford. Love, compassion, guilt, and empathy were luxuries for ordinary people. Emperors needed to be harder, colder, more calculating than anyone else. If that meant sacrificing friends, family, or innocent citizens for the greater good of maintaining power, then that was simply the price of leadership. By age 14, Nero was already showing signs of the megalomania that would define his reign. He loved to perform in public, craving applause and adoration like a drug. Roman aristocrats found this undignified. Theatrical performances were for actors and slaves, not future emperors. But Nero didn't care about dignity. He cared about being seen, being heard, being loved by the masses, even as he terrified them. His performances during this period were actually quite good. He had a pleasant singing voice, decent skills on the lyre, and a natural charisma that made audiences pay attention. If he had been born into a different family, he might have had a successful career as an entertainer. Instead, he was destined to turn the entire Roman Empire into his personal stage, with consequences that would be measured in blood rather than applause. The teenager also showed an early fascination with power and its uses. He would stage elaborate mock trials with his friends, always playing the judge and always delivering creative punishments. Sometimes he would condemn his playmates to imaginary deaths just to see their reactions. His friends laughed nervously and played along, but privately they began to wonder what kind of ruler this boy would become. Even more disturbing were the private conversations Agrippina had with her son about the nature of imperial authority. She explained that emperors were gods among mortals, that their decisions carried divine weight, and that anyone who opposed them was essentially committing blasphemy. She filled his head with stories of previous emperors who had been too merciful, too trusting, too willing to compromise with their enemies. The lesson was clear: Successful emperors were those who eliminated threats before they became dangerous. These lessons were reinforced by the atmosphere of the imperial court, where survival depended on reading the emperor's moods and anticipating his desires. Nero learned to watch how courtiers behaved around Claudius, how they competed for attention and influence, how they formed alliances and betrayed former friends when circumstances changed. It was like a masterclass in human psychology, taught by some of the most ruthless political operators in the ancient world. Agrippina watched her son's development with satisfaction. She had created the perfect weapon, charming enough to win popular support, ruthless enough to eliminate threats, and completely dependent on her guidance. Or so she thought. What she failed to realize was that she was raising a monster who would eventually see her as just another obstacle to be removed. The key to understanding Nero's later cruelty lies in these formative years. He learned that people were tools to be used, that love and fear were currencies to be manipulated, and that there was no problem that couldn't be solved with enough violence and enough gold. His mother had taught him that family was expendable if they stood in your way, and the Roman system had taught him that absolute power was his birthright. As Nero approached his 17th birthday, he had become something unprecedented in Roman history, a future emperor who combined the philosophical education of Marcus Aurelius with the moral vacuum of Caligula. He could quote Seneca's essays on mercy while planning acts of creative brutality. He could deliver speeches about justice while orchestrating show trials. He had learned to use virtue as a mask for vice and wisdom as a cover for madness. By the time Claudius died in 54 AD, most likely poisoned by Agrippina with mushrooms that were decidedly not the fun kind, 17-year-old Nero was ready to take the throne. The Roman Senate, terrified of Agrippina and convinced they could control her naive son, quickly confirmed his ascension. They had no idea what they had just unleashed upon the world. Chapter 2. The Golden Prison. When Nero became emperor at 17, the Roman Empire gained a ruler who thought the entire known world was his personal playground. And, like most teenagers, given unlimited power and resources, he immediately set about proving that absolute power corrupts absolutely. But it does so in the most entertainingly horrific ways possible. The coronation ceremony itself was a preview of the theatrical excesses that would define Nero's reign. While previous emperors had accepted power with solemn dignity, Nero turned his accession into a performance. He delivered speeches that sounded more like dramatic monologues. He posed for sculptors and painters with the studied grace of an actor, and he made sure that every gesture was calculated for maximum visual impact. Even his choice of imperial regalia was carefully considered for its theatrical effect. The Roman people, watching their new emperor prance around like he was auditioning for a play, weren't sure whether to be entertained or terrified. Here was a ruler who seemed more interested in how he looked than in what he actually did, more concerned with staging impressive ceremonies than with governing an empire. It was like having a president whose primary qualification was a successful career in dinner theatre. The early years of Nero's reign were actually relatively stable, but only because he wasn't really ruling. Behind the scenes, 3 people were actually running the empire: his mother, Agrippina, his tutor Seneca, and the Praetorian prefect Boros. This triumvirate had effectively created a puppet emperor, and for a while, it worked. Nero got to play dress-up and perform for crowds, while the adults handled the boring business of governing an empire. Seneca and Burrus, in particular, tried to use their influence to create something unprecedented, a benevolent autocracy guided by philosophical principles. They reduced taxes, reformed the legal system, and attempted to eliminate the worst excesses of imperial corruption. For the first few years of Nero's reign, the Roman Empire actually became a more just and prosperous place to live, despite being ruled by a teenager whose main interest was getting applause. But calling Nero a puppet was like calling a tiger a house cat. Sure, they might look similar when they're napping, But the moment you stop paying attention, someone's getting mauled. The first sign of trouble came when Nero began to chafe against his handler's control. He wanted to make decisions, to flex his imperial muscles, to show everyone that he was the real emperor, not some teenager with a fancy crown. The problem was that Nero's ideas about governance were, to put it charitably, unconventional. Take his solution to Rome's crime problem. Instead of increasing patrols or improving the justice system, Nero decided to go undercover himself. He would disguise himself as a common citizen and roam the streets at night with his friends, looking for trouble. When they found it, they would start fights, break into shops, and generally terrorize the population. It was like having a superhero whose secret identity was a serial killer. These nocturnal adventures weren't just harmless pranks. People were beaten, robbed, and sometimes killed during Nero's crime-fighting expeditions. One night, he allegedly assaulted a senator's wife so severely that she didn't recognize him. When her husband later complained to the emperor about the attack, Nero had to pretend to be outraged while secretly laughing about it. The emperor's night raids became so notorious that wealthy Romans began hiring bodyguards specifically to protect them from their own ruler. Senators would travel in groups after dark, not because they feared common criminals, but because they were terrified of encountering the emperor and his gang of aristocratic thugs. It was a surreal situation where the primary threat to law and order was the person, supposedly, responsible for maintaining it. But the street violence was nothing compared to what was happening in the palace. Nero's relationship with his mother had become a twisted power struggle that would have made Freud weep with joy. Agrippina had spent years accumulating power, and she wasn't about to let her teenage son push her aside. She had created a monster, but she still thought she could control it. The conflict escalated when Agrippina began asserting her authority more openly. She would attend Senate meetings, listening to debates from behind a curtain and passing notes to influence decisions. She received foreign ambassadors in her own right, treating them as if she were a co-emperor rather than just the emperor's mother. Most dramatically, she began issuing orders to provincial governors and military commanders, expecting them to obey her as they would Nero himself. This power-sharing arrangement might have worked with a different kind of emperor, but Nero's entire identity was built around being the center of attention. Having his mother upstage him in political matters was bad enough, but having her claim equal authority was intolerable. It was like being forced to share the spotlight in a play where he was supposed to be the sole star. She was wrong about controlling her creation. Nero's first major act of independence was pursuing a relationship with a freed woman named Claudia. Octa. This wasn't just teenage rebellion. It was a declaration of war against everything Agrippina represented. Octa was beautiful, intelligent, and completely unsuitable for an emperor by traditional Roman standards. She had no political connections, no influential family, and no agenda beyond genuine affection for Nero. In other words, she was everything Agrippina was not. Agrippina's reaction to the relationship was swift and vicious. She had Octa investigated for suspected crimes, spread rumors about her moral character, and even attempted to have her assassinated. But Nero, perhaps for the first time in his life, stood up to his mother's bullying. He provided Octa with bodyguards, moved her into the palace, and made it clear that anyone who threatened her would answer to him personally. The confrontation over Octa revealed something important about Nero's psychology. He didn't just want power, he wanted the freedom to use that power according to his own desires, rather than his mother's agenda. The teenager who had been manipulated and controlled since childhood was beginning to realize that being emperor meant never having to ask anyone's permission ever again. This realization was both liberating and terrifying. On one hand, it meant that Nero could finally express his own personality and pursue his own interests without constant supervision. On the other hand, it meant that all the restraints that had kept his worst impulses in check were about to be removed. The conflict came to a head when Agrippina began making threats. She hinted that she could just as easily make Britannicus emperor instead. that Nero owed his throne entirely to her machinations, and that she could unmake him just as easily as she had made him. This was possibly the worst thing she could have said to a paranoid teenager with unlimited power and a growing taste for violence. Nero's response was swift and brutal. In 55 AD, Britannicus died suddenly during a family dinner. Officially, it was an epileptic seizure. Unofficially, everyone knew it was poison. The 14-year-old boy who had once been Nero's rival for the throne was eliminated with the efficiency of a professional assassination. Nero didn't even have the decency to look surprised. The murder of Britannicus was a masterpiece of political theatre. The poison had been carefully chosen to mimic the symptoms of a seizure. The timing was perfect to suggest natural causes, and Nero's reaction was a performance worthy of the stage he loved so much. He comforted the grieving Claudius, he organized elaborate funeral rites, and he delivered a eulogy that brought tears to the eyes of senators who knew perfectly well that they were watching. The killer mourned his victim. But the most chilling aspect of Britannicus's murder was not the act itself, but Nero's psychological response to it. According to court observers, the emperor seemed genuinely relieved after his stepbrother's death, as if he had finally solved a problem that had been troubling him for years. There was no guilt, no remorse, no second thoughts about what he had done. There was only satisfaction at having eliminated an obstacle to his complete control of the imperial throne. The murder of Britannicus sent a clear message. Nero was done being anyone's puppet. He had tasted blood, and he liked it. More importantly, he had discovered that killing people was an excellent way to solve problems. Why negotiate when you could assassinate? Why compromise when you could simply eliminate the opposition? Agrippina realized, probably too late, that she had created something beyond her control. The boy she had molded into a weapon was now pointing that weapon at her. But instead of backing down, she doubled down on her threats and manipulations. It was like poking a dragon and then acting surprised when it started breathing fire. Meanwhile, Seneca and Burrus watched in growing horror as their student began to show his true nature. They had tried to instill virtue and wisdom in the young emperor, but it became increasingly clear that they had been trying to teach philosophy to a sociopath. Every lesson in ethics became a tutorial in manipulation. Every discussion of justice became a masterclass in creative cruelty. The turning point came when Nero began to realize that being emperor wasn't just about power, it was about performance. The Roman people expected spectacles, entertainment, displays of imperial magnificence, and if there was one thing Nero understood better than governance, it was how to put on a show. He began planning increasingly elaborate public events, gladiator games that lasted for days, chariot races with unprecedented prizes, theatrical performances where he himself took center stage. The Roman aristocracy was horrified. Performing in public was beneath an emperor's dignity, but the common people loved it. Here was a ruler who actually seemed to care about entertaining them. But entertainment cost money, and even the Roman Empire's vast wealth had its limits. Nero's solution was elegantly simple. If the treasury was running low, he would just take money from people who had too much of it. Treason trials became a convenient way to eliminate wealthy citizens and confiscate their property. All you needed was a few paid witnesses, some creative interpretation of the law, and suddenly a rich merchant became a traitor whose estate now belonged to the emperor. This was the birth of Nero's reign of terror, but it didn't start with the dramatic cruelties that would make him infamous. It began with bureaucratic murder, the systematic elimination of anyone who posed a threat or possessed something Nero wanted. It was tyranny with a smile, oppression dressed up as justice. The Roman Senate, already neutered by previous emperors, found itself completely powerless. They could either applaud Nero's actions or join his victims. Most chose applause, even as they privately plotted and prayed for his downfall. They had helped create this monster by confirming his ascension, and now they were trapped in the golden cage of his reign. By 59 AD, 5 years into his rule, Nero had transformed from a puppet emperor into something far more dangerous, a confident tyrant who had learned that fear was more useful than love, that spectacle could distract from suffering, and that there was no problem that couldn't be solved with sufficient creativity and unlimited cruelty. He was about to put those lessons to their ultimate test. Chapter 3: Matricide and Madness. If you want to understand the precise moment when Nero crossed the line from troubled teenager with anger issues to full-blown monster, look no further than the year 59 AD. That's when he decided to solve his mother problem once and for all, in a way that would have impressed Machiavelli and horrified everyone else. Agrippina had become more than just an annoyance. She had become a threat to Nero's vision of absolute power. She still wielded considerable influence with the Praetorian Guard and the Senate, and her constant meddling in imperial affairs was cramping Nero's style. Worse, she had begun making increasingly bold power plays, even suggesting that she should rule alongside her son as co-emperor. This was like asking a lion to share its dinner. It wasn't going to end well for anyone involved. But killing your own mother, even in ancient Rome, was considered a bit beyond the pale. Patricide was one of the most heinous crimes imaginable, punishable by being sewn into a sack with a snake, a rooster, a dog, and a monkey, then thrown into the sea. Even for an emperor, murdering mum required some creative planning. Nero's first idea was poison, the traditional Roman solution to family problems. He had Locusta, Rome's most famous poisoner, prepare a special dinner for Agrippina. But either the poison wasn't strong enough, or Agrippina had built up an immunity through years of paranoid precautions. She survived the attempt and began to grow even more suspicious of her son's intentions. Undeterred, Nero moved to Plan B, a collapsing ceiling. He had engineers design a special bedroom ceiling that would collapse on command, crushing anyone unfortunate enough to be sleeping beneath it. But when the moment came to trigger the trap, the mechanism failed. Agrippina woke up to find chunks of plaster in her bed and her son's assassins scrambling to explain why the ceiling had suddenly developed structural problems. By this point, you might think Nero would take the hint that perhaps matricide wasn't in the stars. But you'd be wrong. If anything, the failed attempts only made him more determined to succeed. It was like a twisted version of if at first you don't succeed, try again, except with more murder and fewer life lessons. Plan C was Nero's masterpiece of homicidal engineering, the collapsible boat. He had naval architects design a special vessel that would appear perfectly normal but could be made to fall apart in deep water, drowning its passengers while making the whole thing look like an unfortunate accident. It was diabolically clever, the kind of death trap that would have made James Bond villains take notes. In March of 59 AD, Nero invited his mother to join him for the Festival of Minerva at his villa in Boie. The atmosphere was cordial, almost loving. They dined together, shared wine, and for a moment it might have seemed like the old days when Agrippina was the power behind the throne and Nero was her dutiful son. It was a performance worthy of the theatre Nero loved so much. When it came time for Agrippina to return home across the Bay of Naples, Nero personally escorted her to the special boat he had prepared. He kissed her goodbye, held her hand, and watched with what observers described as unusual emotion as she departed. What they didn't know was that they were witnessing a son's final farewell to the mother he was about to murder. The boat made it several miles from shore before the mechanism activated. The vessel began to break apart, planks separating and the deck collapsing as designed. In the chaos and darkness, passengers and crew were thrown into the cold water. Some drowned immediately, weighed down by their clothes and unable to swim in the churning sea. But Agrippina, the woman who had survived the murderous politics of the Roman court for decades, was not so easily killed. She was an excellent swimmer, and despite a shoulder injury from falling debris, she managed to stay afloat until a fishing boat rescued her. As she was pulled from the water, bedraggled but very much alive, she must have realized that her son had just tried to kill her in the most elaborate way possible. Any normal mother might have confronted her son, demanded an explanation, or fled to safety. But Agrippina was not a normal mother. She was a Roman aristocrat who understood power better than most emperors. Instead of revealing that she knew about the assassination attempt, she sent a message to Nero telling him that she had survived a terrible boating accident and was grateful to the gods for preserving her life. It was a masterstroke of psychological warfare, letting Nero know she was alive while pretending she didn't suspect his involvement. Nero's reaction to this message was pure panic. Not only had his elaborate murder plot failed, but now his mother knew he had tried to kill her and was playing games with that knowledge. In his paranoid mind, this could only mean one thing. She was planning her revenge. Unable to sleep or think clearly, Nero summoned his advisors in the middle of the night, Seneca and Burrus. The men who had tried to guide him toward virtue and wisdom found themselves being asked for advice on how to commit matricide. The philosophical irony was probably lost on everyone in the room. After hours of desperate planning, they settled on the most direct approach: send armed soldiers to finish what the boat had failed to do. There would be no more elaborate schemes, no more attempts at plausible deniability. This would be straightforward murder, quick and brutal. At dawn, a squad of Praetorian guards surrounded Agrippina's villa. They found her in her bedroom, still recovering from her injuries, but alert and defiant. When she saw the soldiers, she knew immediately why they had come. According to the historian Tacitus, her last words were spoken to the centurion raising his sword. "Strike here," she said, pointing to her womb, "for this bore Nero." Even in death, Agrippina had the last word, a final reminder to her son of what he was destroying. The woman who had schemed and murdered to put him on the throne died knowing that she had created the very monster who was killing her. When news of Agrippina's death reached Rome, the official story was that she had committed suicide after being discovered in a plot against the emperor. Few believed it, but fewer still were willing to voice their doubts. The message was clear: if Nero could kill his own mother, he could kill anyone. The psychological impact on Nero himself was profound and immediate. Ancient sources report that he was plagued by nightmares, seeing his mother's ghost and hearing the Fury's wings beating round his bed. Whether these were genuine hallucinations or the product of guilty conscience, they marked the beginning of Nero's descent into the paranoid madness that would define the rest of his reign. But perhaps most chilling of all was Nero's public reaction to his mother's death. After the initial panic and guilt, he seemed to experience a kind of relief, even liberation. He had proven to himself and to Rome that there was no boundary he wouldn't cross, no sacred bond he wouldn't sever in service of his power. The teenager who had once been controlled by his mother's ambitions had become a man who recognized no authority but his own desires. Matricide had transformed Nero from a puppet emperor into something far more dangerous. A ruler who had learned that the most effective way to solve any problem was to kill it, and that the Roman people would accept even the most monstrous acts as long as they were accompanied by enough bread and circuses. The boy who had murdered his mother was now ready to turn that same creative cruelty on an entire empire. Chapter 4: The Artist Emperor's Bloody Canvas. After successfully murdering his mother, Nero might have been expected to settle into a period of quiet consolidation, perhaps focusing on the mundane business of actually governing an empire. Instead, he decided that what Rome really needed was an emperor who moonlighted as a rock star, with all the ego, excess, and creative destruction that such a combination implies. Nero had always fancied himself an artist. He wrote poetry that he forced senators to applaud, composed songs that he performed at state dinners, and acted in plays where criticizing his performance could literally cost you your head. It was like having a dictator who thought he was the next big thing on Roman Idol, except the judges couldn't vote him off without risking execution. His artistic ambitions weren't just a hobby. They were a core part of his identity and his vision for Rome. In Nero's mind, he wasn't just an emperor. He was a cultural revolutionary who would transform Roman civilization through the power of art. The fact that his art was mediocre at best, and that his cultural revolution involved a lot of murder, was apparently beside the point. The Roman aristocracy was horrified by their emperor's theatrical pretensions. In their world, performance was for slaves and freedmen, not for the ruler of the known world. When Nero announced his intention to perform publicly at the Juvenalia Games in 59 AD, the Senate practically fainted. Here was their emperor, the heir to Augustus and Julius Caesar, planning to prance around on stage like a common actor. But Nero didn't care about aristocratic sensibilities. He cared about applause, adoration, and the intoxicating rush of performing for an audience. When he took the stage for the first time, wearing a mask and costume, he experienced something that no amount of imperial power could provide: the immediate, visceral response of a crowd hanging on his every word and gesture. The audience, naturally, went wild. What choice did they have? This wasn't just any performer. This was the emperor, the man who could have them killed for insufficient enthusiasm. They applauded until their hands bled. They cheered until their voices gave out. And they pretended that they were witnessing the birth of a new Orpheus, rather than watching a mediocre tyrant have a very public midlife crisis. Nero was hooked. From that moment on, he saw his role as emperor through the lens of performance. Every public appearance became a theatrical event. Every speech a monologue designed to showcase his talents. Every policy decision a chance to demonstrate his artistic vision for Rome. This vision involved a lot of gold, marble, and human suffering. Nero's first major architectural project was the expansion of his palace complex. The existing imperial residence was, in his opinion, insufficiently magnificent for an artist of his caliber. So he began construction of what would become known as the Domos Transitoria, a sprawling complex that would connect the various imperial properties on the Palatine Hill into a single, cohesive palace that reflected his refined aesthetic sensibilities. The Domos Transitoria featured innovations that were impressive even by Roman standards: rotating dining rooms, elaborate water features, walls covered in gold leaf, and ceilings decorated with precious stones that sparkled like stars. It was beautiful, excessive, and ruinously expensive, draining the imperial treasury at a rate that made even Roman accountants nervous. But the palace was just the beginning. Nero had plans for transforming all of Rome into a city worthy of his artistic vision. He wanted wider streets, more impressive public buildings, better theaters, and grander spectacles. The fact that such transformations would require demolishing large portions of the existing city, displacing thousands of residents, and bankrupting the empire was merely a practical challenge to be overcome. To fund his artistic ambitions, Nero refined the system of judicial murder that he had begun earlier in his reign. Wealthy citizens found themselves accused of increasingly creative crimes: conspiracy against the emperor, disrespecting imperial artistic performances, failing to applaud with sufficient enthusiasm, or simply having too much money while the emperor needed more. The trials themselves became theatrical performances in their own right. Nero would sometimes preside personally, treating the proceedings like dramatic readings where he was both director and star. Witnesses would be coached in their testimonies. Evidence would be crafted for maximum emotional impact, and sentences would be delivered with the kind of dramatic flourish that Nero thought demonstrated his artistic sensibility. The condemned rarely went quietly. Some, like the philosopher Thrasippetus, used their final moments to deliver speeches that were more eloquent than anything Nero had ever written. Others, like the poet Lucan, chose to die reciting their own verses, a final act of artistic defiance against an emperor who had corrupted everything he touched. But perhaps the most telling incident of this period involved Nero's treatment of his former friend and advisor, Seneca. The old philosopher had grown increasingly uncomfortable with his students, transformation from promising youth to murderous tyrant. He began requesting permission to retire, to leave public life, and spend his remaining years in quiet contemplation. Nero's response was chilling in its casual cruelty. He told Seneca that he was free to leave whenever he wished, but that such a departure might be misinterpreted as criticism of the emperor's policies. It would be unfortunate, Nero suggested, if people thought that Seneca disapproved of the artistic direction Rome was taking under its enlightened ruler. The message was clear: Seneca was free to go, but leaving would be interpreted as treason, and treason was punishable by death. The man who had tried to teach Nero virtue and wisdom found himself trapped by his own students' perverted logic, forced to remain as window dressing for a regime he increasingly despised. This was typical of Nero's approach to power during this period. He had learned to weaponize loyalty itself, turning every relationship into a test of devotion that could only be passed through increasing levels of complicity. Friends became accomplices, advisors became enablers, and critics became corpses. The common people of Rome, meanwhile, found themselves caught between fascination and terror. On one hand, Nero's spectacles were undeniably entertaining. His gladiator games were more elaborate than ever. His theatrical performances were frequent and free, and his building projects promised a more beautiful city. On the other hand, the constant executions, the arbitrary confiscations, and the general atmosphere of paranoia made daily life increasingly unpredictable and dangerous. It was during this period that the first whispers began to circulate, identifying Nero with the Antichrist. Christian communities, still small and secretive, saw in the matricidal emperor a figure of pure evil, a ruler whose very existence seemed to herald the end times. The number 666, they claimed, was a code for Nero's name, and his reign was evidence that Satan himself had taken control of Rome. Whether or not Nero was aware of these Christian interpretations of his rule, he certainly seemed determined to live up to them. By 62 AD, 6 years after his mother's murder, he had transformed the Roman Empire into a theater of cruelty where artistic pretension provided the soundtrack to systematic oppression. But all of this, the murders and the spectacles, the architectural projects and the fiscal irresponsibility, were merely the opening acts in Nero's greatest performance. The real show was about to begin, and it would literally burn Rome to the ground. Chapter 5. When Rome Burned. July 18, 64 AD, started like any other sweltering summer day in Rome. The city's million-plus inhabitants went about their business, packed into insulae apartment buildings that were essentially vertical slums, shopping in markets that overflowed into narrow streets, and generally living the crowded, chaotic life that defined the ancient world's greatest metropolis. By the time the sun set, much of that world would be ash, and Emperor Nero would have acquired the most enduring myth of his reign. The Great Fire of Rome began in the shops at the base of the Circus Maximus, spreading quickly through the wooden structures and narrow alleyways of the commercial district. Summer fires were common in Roman cities, but this one was different. Fed by strong winds and fueled by the densely packed buildings, it roared through 14 districts of the city with a speed and intensity that left even experienced firefighters helpless. For 6 days and 7 nights, Rome burned. The fire consumed everything in its path: homes, shops, temples, public buildings, and priceless works of art that had taken centuries to accumulate. Ancient neighborhoods that had existed since the founding of the Republic were reduced to smoldering ruins in hours. The Circus Maximus itself, where 250,000 Romans had cheered gladiatorial contests, was gutted. The Temple of Vesta, home to the sacred flame that was never supposed to be extinguished, ironically became another casualty of the conflagration. Panic gripped the population as hundreds of thousands of people fled their homes with whatever they could carry. The roads leading out of the city became clogged with refugees, their possessions piled onto carts or strapped to their backs. Those who couldn't escape in time found themselves trapped in a nightmare of smoke, flames, and collapsing buildings. The death toll, while never precisely recorded, was certainly in the thousands. And where was Emperor Nero during this catastrophe? According to legend, he was on his private stage, playing his lyre and singing about the fall of Troy, while his capital burned around him. This image of Nero fiddling while Rome burned has persisted for 2,000 years as the ultimate symbol of imperial callousness and disconnection from reality. The problem is, it's not true. Nero wasn't even in Rome when the fire started. He was at his villa in Antium, about 30 miles away, probably working on his latest artistic project or planning another theatrical performance. When news of the fire reached him, he rushed back to the city and immediately began organizing relief efforts. But the truth was never going to be as compelling as the fiction. Romans needed someone to blame for their suffering, and Nero had already established himself as a figure of such casual cruelty that any atrocity seemed possible. The man who had murdered his own mother, the reasoning went, would certainly be capable of burning his own city. In reality, Nero's response to the fire was actually one of the more competent actions of his reign. He opened his own palaces and gardens to house refugees, organized the distribution of emergency supplies, and began planning for the city's reconstruction almost immediately. He reduced the price of grain to help feed the displaced population and used his own funds to provide temporary shelter for those who had lost their homes. But good deeds don't make for memorable stories, and Nero had already accumulated enough genuine scandals that people were perfectly willing to believe he was capable of the most monstrous acts imaginable. When the rumor began circulating that he had started the fire himself to clear land for his architectural projects, it found fertile ground in the minds of people who had watched him eliminate rivals, waste the treasury on spectacles, and turn governance into a theatrical performance. The rumor gained credibility when Nero announced his plans for rebuilding the city. The new Rome he envisioned would be a marvel of urban planning, wider streets to prevent future fires, better building codes to ensure safety, and more open spaces to create a more livable environment. At the center of it all would be his new palace, the Domus Aurea, or Golden House, a complex so vast and luxurious that it would make his previous architectural projects look modest by comparison. The Golden House was to be Nero's masterpiece, a palace that would demonstrate both his artistic vision and his imperial power. It would cover nearly 200 acres in the heart of Rome, featuring artificial lakes, landscaped gardens, and buildings decorated with gold, precious stones, and the finest artworks from across the empire. The main dining hall would have a rotating ceiling that mimicked the movement of the heavens, while the walls would be adorned with frescoes depicting Nero's own heroic deeds. To many Romans, the timing was suspicious. Their emperor had spent years complaining about the cramped, chaotic nature of the old city, and now, immediately after a fire had conveniently cleared vast areas of prime real estate, he was ready with detailed plans for a magnificent new palace. It was the kind of coincidence that conspiracy theories are made of. Whether or not Nero actually started the fire, he certainly took advantage of its aftermath. The land acquisition process for the Golden House was handled with typical imperial efficiency, meaning the property owners had no choice but to sell at whatever price Nero deemed fair. Families who had lived on the same plots for generations found themselves relocated to make way for the emperor's artistic vision. The cost of the Golden House was astronomical, even by the standards of imperial excess. Ancient sources suggest that it consumed more gold and precious materials than most provinces produced in a year. The engineering challenges alone required innovations in construction and design that pushed Roman technology to its limits. It was beautiful, it was innovative, and it was so expensive that it threatened to bankrupt the empire. To fund his reconstruction projects, Nero intensified the fiscal policies that had already made him unpopular with the wealthy classes. Property taxes were raised, Inheritance laws were changed to benefit the imperial treasury, and the judicial murder of wealthy citizens became an even more routine method of raising funds. Every execution meant another estate to be confiscated. Every conspiracy trial meant more property for the emperor's use. But the fire had also created an opportunity for Nero to address another problem that had been growing throughout his reign: the increasing influence of Christianity in Rome. The new religion had been spreading among the lower classes, offering hope to slaves and freedmen, while preaching a message that was potentially subversive to imperial authority. Christians claimed loyalty to a king who was not Caesar, and their refusal to participate in emperor worship made them suspect in the eyes of traditional Romans, looking for someone to blame for the fire, and perhaps genuinely believing that the Christians were responsible. Nero launched the first systematic persecution of Christians in Roman history. Hundreds, possibly thousands of Christians were arrested and executed in ways that were creative even by Roman standards. Some were crucified, others were sewn into animal skins and thrown to wild dogs, and still others were used as human torches to light Nero's gardens during evening entertainments. The persecution was brutal and sustained, lasting for months and claiming victims from across the Christian community. Among those executed was the Apostle Peter, who, according to tradition, requested to be crucified upside down because he felt unworthy to die in the same manner as Jesus. Paul, the great missionary who had brought Christianity to the Gentile world, was also executed during this persecution, though, as a Roman citizen, he was granted the more merciful death of beheading. For Christians, Nero's persecution confirmed their identification of him with the Antichrist. Here was a ruler who had murdered his own mother, who lived in unprecedented luxury while his people suffered, and who now seemed determined to wipe their faith from the earth entirely. The Book of Revelation, written during or shortly after Nero's reign, contains imagery that many scholars believe refers directly to the emperor, the beast whose number is 666, the whore of Babylon dressed in purple and scarlet, the ruler who makes war on the saints. The irony was that Nero's persecution, rather than destroying Christianity, actually helped spread it. The courage shown by Christian martyrs in the face of horrific deaths impressed many Romans, and the community's refusal to abandon their beliefs, even under torture, demonstrated a strength of conviction that traditional Roman religion seemed to lack. Every execution created new converts. Every torture session became a testament to the power of faith over imperial authority. But perhaps most damaging to Nero's reputation was the way he chose to present the persecution to the Roman people. Rather than simply executing Christians quietly, he turned their deaths into public spectacles, elaborate entertainments that combined his love of theater with his talent for cruelty. Christians were forced to reenact mythological stories before being killed, dressed as characters from plays before being torn apart by wild animals, or used as living set pieces in tableaux that culminated in their deaths. The Roman people, no strangers to violence, found these spectacles excessive even by their standards. There's a difference between watching gladiators fight in the arena, where death comes to warriors who have chosen their fate, and watching innocent people tortured to death for the entertainment of an emperor who seemed to have lost all connection to human decency. Even the most bloodthirsty spectators began to feel uncomfortable with the level of sadism on display. More importantly, the persecution revealed something troubling about Nero's psychological state. The emperor, who had once been content to eliminate individual rivals, now seemed driven to destroy entire communities. The man who had murdered his mother in a moment of paranoid rage was now orchestrating systematic campaigns of extermination. It was as if the act of matricide had broken some fundamental restraint in Nero's psyche, leaving him capable of any atrocity as long as it served his immediate desires. Chapter 6. The Paranoid Emperor's Web of Fear. By 65 AD, Rome had become a city where whispered conversations could be fatal, and where loyalty was measured not by what you said, but by how quickly you denounced your neighbors. Nero had successfully created an atmosphere of such pervasive fear that the empire's greatest minds spent their days crafting elaborate displays of devotion to an emperor they privately considered a monster. The Great Fire had marked a turning point in Nero's reign, not just because of the destruction it caused, but because of how it revealed the emperor's complete disconnection from the reality of his subjects' lives. While Romans struggled to rebuild their homes and businesses, Nero was focused on his artistic projects and increasingly paranoid about threats to his power. Every criticism became treason, every suggestion became conspiracy, and every independent thought became evidence of disloyalty. The emperor's paranoia was not entirely irrational. There were indeed plots against his life, and not just from Christians or disgruntled citizens. Roman senators, generals, and even members of his own household were beginning to whisper about the possibility of regime change. The problem was that Nero's response to real threats was so disproportionate and indiscriminate that it created even more enemies, turning potential allies into actual conspirators and transforming political opposition into existential warfare. The most serious threat came in the form of the Pisonian conspiracy, named after Gaius Calpurnius Piso, a respected senator who had become the focal point for aristocratic resistance to Nero's rule. Piso wasn't just any disgruntled politician. He was cultured, intelligent, and popular enough to serve as a credible alternative to the increasingly erratic emperor. More dangerously, he had connections throughout the Roman establishment, including members of the Praetorian Guard who were supposed to be Nero's most loyal protectors. The conspiracy that formed around Piso included some of the most distinguished names in Roman society. There was Flavius Scaevonas, a senator known for his oratory skills; Lucan, the poet who had once been Nero's friend and rival; Fienus, Rufus, one of the Praetorian prefects, and dozens of others who had grown tired of living under a tyrant who seemed more interested in artistic performance than effective governance. Their plan was elegantly simple: assassinate Nero during the games at the Circus Maximus, where he would be surrounded by crowds but relatively vulnerable to attack. Piso would then be acclaimed as emperor by the conspirators, who would present him to the people and the army as a reasonable alternative to the theatrical madman currently occupying the throne. It might have worked, if not for the fact that keeping secrets in imperial Rome was nearly impossible. Too many people knew about the plot, and eventually someone talked. The conspiracy unraveled when Flavius Scaevonas made the mistake of acting suspiciously before the planned assassination. He freed his slaves, made out his will, and sharpened a dagger. Actions that caught the attention of his servants, who reported their master's unusual behavior to the authorities. When Nero learned of the conspiracy, his reaction was swift and merciless. This wasn't just another individual threat to be eliminated. This was evidence of a systematic campaign to destroy him, proof that his enemies were everywhere and that only the most extreme measures could ensure his survival. The investigation that followed was a masterpiece of paranoid brutality. Suspects were arrested based on the flimsiest evidence: a casual conversation overheard by a slave, a letter that could be interpreted as seditious, or simply being known to associate with any of the actual conspirators. Torture was used not just to extract confessions, but to generate new names, new suspects, new threads to be followed until the web of accusation encompassed much of the Roman elite. Lucan, the young poet who had once been Nero's protege, was among the first to be arrested. Under torture, he not only confessed to his own involvement, but implicated his own mother, hoping that betraying her might earn him mercy. It didn't. Nero ordered him to commit suicide, and Lucan chose to die reciting verses from his own epic poem about Caesar's civil wars. His final act, a demonstration that even in death he was a better artist than his former friend. Seneca, the philosopher who had tried to guide Nero toward virtue, was also implicated in the conspiracy. though his actual involvement remains unclear. Whether or not he was truly part of the plot, Nero had grown tired of his old tutor's moral authority and implicit criticism. The order for Seneca to commit suicide was delivered with mock regret, as if Nero were sadly forced to eliminate a beloved mentor who had unfortunately chosen the wrong side. Seneca's death became one of the most famous suicide scenes in Roman history. He opened his veins in a warm bath, surrounded by his friends and disciples, and spent his final hours discussing philosophy and dictating his thoughts to scribes. It was the kind of noble death that Roman culture celebrated, a demonstration that even under a tyrant, a good man could choose the manner of his departure from the world. But perhaps the most telling victim of the conspiracy's aftermath was Piso himself. When offered the chance to become emperor, even briefly, before his inevitable execution, Piso declined. He chose instead to commit suicide immediately, explaining that he preferred death to the prospect of replacing one tyrant with another. His refusal to seize power, even momentarily, was both an act of principle and a final insult to Nero's legitimacy. The Pisonian conspiracy's failure had two immediate effects on Nero's rule. First, it confirmed his belief that he was surrounded by enemies who would stop at nothing to destroy him. Every senator became a potential assassin, every general a possible usurper, every friend a likely betrayer. This paranoia would drive his actions for the remaining years of his reign, turning governance into an endless cycle of preemptive strikes against imaginary threats. Second, it demonstrated to the Roman people that even the most distinguished citizens were not safe from their emperor's suspicions. If men like Seneca and Lucan could be executed on charges of treason, then no one was beyond Nero's reach. The message was clear: absolute loyalty was the only protection, and even that might not be enough. In the aftermath of the conspiracy, Nero's behavior became increasingly erratic. He began to see omens and portents everywhere, interpreting random events as evidence of divine approval or cosmic threats. He consulted astrologers, fortune-tellers, and dream interpreters with increasing frequency, looking for reassurance that his reign would continue and his enemies would be defeated. His public appearances became more theatrical and more desperate. He would perform for hours, demanding applause and adoration from audiences who were terrified to show anything less than complete enthusiasm. Stories spread of senators who were forced to sit through entire concerts, forbidden to leave even to relieve themselves, while Nero sang and played and waited for their reactions. The emperor's relationship with reality became increasingly tenuous. He began to believe his own propaganda, convinced that he was not just a competent ruler, but an artistic genius whose vision would transform human civilization. When people failed to appreciate his talents, he interpreted their lack of enthusiasm as evidence of their moral deficiency rather than his own limitations. Perhaps most disturbing of all was how Nero began to treat his closest associates, the people who had helped him rise to power, who had enabled his worst impulses and participated in his crimes, now found themselves under suspicion simply because they knew too much about his methods. Loyalty became a liability, because loyal servants were witnesses to acts that Nero increasingly wanted to forget or deny. This was the psychological landscape that Nero inhabited as his reign entered its final phase. He had created a system where fear was the primary emotion, where survival required constant performance, and where the emperor himself had become the greatest threat to the stability of the empire he ruled. Rome had become a stage for one man's increasingly unhinged performance, with a population of millions serving as both audience and potential victims in a drama that seemed to have no script except the emperor's paranoid imagination. The greatest performance of Nero's career was still to come, but it would not be on any stage he had planned. Chapter 7. The Final Act. As 68 AD dawned, Nero had been emperor for 14 years, long enough to transform the Roman Empire from a relatively stable autocracy into a theater of paranoid cruelty. But empires, like audiences, eventually tire of even the most compelling performances. And Nero was about to discover that his greatest enemy was not any individual conspirator, but the collective exhaustion of a people who had endured enough of his artistic vision. The beginning of the end came not from Rome, but from the provinces, where governors and generals who had spent years watching Nero's excesses finally decided they had seen enough. Gaius Julius Vindex, the governor of Gallia Lugdunensis, was the first to openly rebel, declaring that Rome deserved an emperor who was actually interested in governing rather than performing. Vindex's rebellion was significant not because of its military strength, which was limited, but because of what it represented, proof that even Nero's own appointees were turning against him. Here was a man who owed his position entirely to imperial favor, yet he was willing to risk everything to remove Nero from power. It was a clear signal that the emperor's authority was collapsing at every level of the imperial hierarchy. Nero's initial response to the rebellion was characteristically tone-deaf. Instead of immediately mobilizing the legions or attempting to address the grievances that had motivated the revolt, he spent several days working on a new water organ he had designed. When his advisors finally convinced him that the situation required his attention, his primary concern was not military strategy, but whether the rebellion might interfere with his planned artistic tour of Greece. This disconnect from reality was not new, but it was becoming increasingly obvious to everyone around Nero that their emperor lived in a fantasy world where his artistic achievements were more important than the survival of his regime. While provinces burned and armies marched, Nero was composing songs and planning theatrical performances, utterly convinced that his cultural contributions would ultimately matter more than temporary political difficulties. The real crisis began when Servius Sulpicius Galba, the governor of Hispania Tarraconensis, joined Vindex's rebellion. Galba was everything Nero was not: a distinguished military commander, a competent administrator, and a man whose idea of entertainment didn't involve watching people being torn apart by wild animals. More importantly, he had the respect of the legions under his command and the political connections necessary to mount a serious challenge to Nero's throne. When news reached Rome that Galba had declared himself emperor and was marching on the capital, Nero's response revealed just how completely he had lost touch with the realities of power. His first instinct was to challenge Galba to a contest of artistic skill, suggesting that they settle their differences through a competition of musical performance rather than military force. It was like proposing to resolve World War II through a dance. Eventually, even Nero realized that poetry contests were not going to save his throne. He began to make preparations for war, but his efforts revealed the extent to which his paranoid purges had weakened his own position. Many of his most competent generals were dead, executed on suspicions of disloyalty. The Praetorian Guard, once his most reliable supporters, had been alienated by years of arbitrary executions and broken promises. Even his own household slaves were beginning to look for opportunities to defect to the winning side. The final blow came when Nero learned that the Senate had declared him a public enemy and condemned him to death in the traditional Roman manner, being beaten to death with rods. This was not just a political maneuver, it was a complete repudiation of his entire reign. An official declaration that 14 years of Nero's rule had been a disaster for Rome and its people. Faced with military defeat, political isolation, and the prospect of a particularly unpleasant execution, Nero made the decision that would define his legacy. He chose to run. On the night of June 9th, 68 AD, the man who had once commanded the loyalty of 50 million people fled Rome with only 4 companions, reduced to skulking through the countryside like a common criminal. The journey to his final refuge was a humiliating reversal of everything Nero had represented during his reign. The emperor, who had demanded applause from captive audiences, now hid his face to avoid recognition. The man who had built palaces of unprecedented luxury spent his last night in a slave's hovel, drinking water from a muddy pool and eating stale bread with his hands. But even in these desperate circumstances, Nero remained true to his nature. As he prepared to take his own life to avoid capture, he spent precious time lamenting not the suffering he had caused or the empire he had destroyed, but the loss of his artistic talents. "What an artist perishes with me," he allegedly declared, viewing his own death primarily as a tragedy for Roman culture, rather than as the natural consequence of 14 years of tyrannical misrule. The actual moment of Nero's death was appropriately theatrical. As he heard the sound of approaching horsemen coming to arrest him, he pressed a dagger to his throat, but found himself unable to complete the act. It was left to his secretary, Epaphroditus, to help him push the blade home, ending the life of the man who had terrorized an empire but couldn't face his own mortality without assistance. Nero died on June 9th, 68 AD, at the age of 30, and his death marked the end not just of his personal reign of terror, but of the entire Julio-Claudian dynasty that had ruled Rome since Augustus. The empire he left behind was in chaos, with multiple claimants to the throne and legions marching in every direction. The year following his death would become known as the Year of the Four Emperors, as military commanders fought for control of the imperial succession. But perhaps the most fitting epitaph for Nero's reign was the reaction of the Roman people to news of his death. There was no great outpouring of grief, no calls for vengeance against his enemies, no nostalgic reminiscences about the good times under his rule. Instead, there was relief, the collective sigh of a population that had finally been freed from the constant fear of their own emperor's artistic ambitions. The man who had spent his entire reign craving applause and adoration died unmourned and unremembered, except as a cautionary tale about what happens when unlimited power is combined with unlimited ego and unlimited cruelty. Chapter 8. The Undying Monster. Death, it turns out, was not the end of Nero's capacity to terrify people. In fact, it might have been the beginning of his most successful performance yet. While his body lay mouldering in a modest grave, his reputation began a transformation that would make him immortal in ways he could never have imagined during his lifetime. The immediate aftermath of Nero's suicide created a power vacuum that nearly destroyed the Roman Empire. The Year of the Four Emperors saw generals Galba, Otho, Vitellius, and finally Vespasian fight for control of the throne, with each transition marked by civil war, massacre, and chaos that made Nero's reign look almost stable by comparison. It was as if the emperor's death had released all the violence and ambition he had spent 14 years suppressing through terror. But while Rome burned, literally and figuratively, something strange began happening in the provinces. Rumors started spreading that Nero wasn't actually dead, that he had somehow escaped his pursuers and was gathering support for a return to power. These weren't just idle gossip, they were persistent, detailed stories that seemed to offer hope to some people and terror to others. The first false Nero appeared in 69 AD, just months after the emperor's death. He was a slave from Pontus who bore a physical resemblance to the dead emperor and had learned to play the lyre well enough to convince audiences that he was the returned ruler. His performance was so convincing that he actually gathered a significant following before being captured and executed by the Roman authorities. But killing one false Nero didn't stop others from appearing. Over the next 20 years, at least 2 more pretenders claimed to be the surviving emperor, each gathering enough support to worry the Roman government. The most successful was supported by the Parthian Empire, Rome's great eastern rival, who were delighted to have a potential puppet emperor they could use to destabilize Roman politics. These false Neros revealed something important about how Nero was remembered by ordinary people, particularly in the eastern provinces, where his love of Greek culture and theatrical performance had made him relatively popular. While the Roman elite remembered him as a tyrant and murderer, many common citizens recalled an emperor who had at least tried to entertain them, who had built magnificent structures and who had seemed to care more about popular approval than aristocratic dignity. This split in Nero's posthumous reputation would persist for centuries. To educated Romans and Christians, he remained the ultimate symbol of imperial evil, the emperor who had murdered his own mother and persecuted the faithful. But to some groups, particularly in the Eastern Mediterranean, he became a figure of nostalgia, remembered as a patron of the arts who had been destroyed by jealous senators and scheming generals. The Christian interpretation of Nero's legacy was particularly influential in shaping how later generations would remember him. The Book of Revelation, written during or shortly after his reign, contained imagery that early Christians clearly associated with the emperor, the beast whose number was 666, the whore of Babylon, the great persecutor of the faithful. All of these apocalyptic symbols were understood by contemporary readers as references to Nero and his regime. But Christians went further than simply identifying Nero with evil. They developed the doctrine of Nero redivivus, the belief that the emperor would return from the dead to herald the end times. Some Christian texts suggested that Nero was not actually dead but had fled to the east, where he was gathering an army of demons and foreign peoples to return and destroy Rome. Others proposed that he had indeed died but would be resurrected by Satan to serve as the Antichrist in the final battle between good and evil. This Christian mythology about Nero's return influenced not just religious thought, but political expectations throughout the late Roman period. Every crisis, every invasion, every internal conflict was interpreted by some as evidence that Nero had returned to fulfill his apocalyptic role. The emperor who had craved immortality through his art had achieved a different kind of eternal life through his infamy. Medieval chroniclers, working primarily from Christian sources, painted Nero in even darker colors than his contemporaries had used. He became not just a bad emperor, but a figure of pure evil, a man whose crimes were so monstrous that they served as proof of humanity's capacity for sin. Medieval texts describe him committing acts that were physically impossible and psychologically incredible, transforming him from a real historical figure into a legendary embodiment of tyranny. The Renaissance brought a more nuanced view of Nero, as scholars gained access to classical sources like Tacitus and Suetonius that provided more balanced accounts of his reign. But even these more scholarly treatments couldn't escape the fundamental problem of Nero's legacy: the gap between his self-image as an artist and cultural revolutionary and the reality of his rule as a sequence of murders, persecutions, and spectacular failures of judgment. Modern historians have attempted to rehabilitate Nero's reputation somewhat, pointing out that some of the worst stories about him were probably exaggerated by hostile sources, and that his policies weren't always as irrational as they appeared. They note that his building projects did improve Rome's infrastructure, that his spectacles did provide entertainment for the masses, and that his artistic interests, however self-indulgent, reflected a genuine attempt to elevate Roman culture. But these scholarly defenses run up against the fundamental facts of Nero's reign. He did murder his mother. He did execute thousands of innocent people. He did waste enormous resources on personal projects while his people suffered. And he did create an atmosphere of terror that made life unbearable for anyone who attracted his attention. Whatever his artistic achievements, whatever his architectural contributions, whatever his genuine talents as a performer, Nero remains a figure whose legacy is defined by cruelty, paranoia, and the abuse of absolute power. Perhaps the most fitting monument to Nero's legacy is not any building or artwork he created, but the simple fact that his name has become synonymous with tyranny in languages around the world. When people want to describe a leader who has lost all connection to reality, who has become so obsessed with their own image that they ignore their actual responsibilities, who has turned governance into a form of sadistic entertainment, they call that person Nero-like or Neronian. This linguistic immortality is the opposite of what Nero wanted for himself. He craved to be remembered as a great artist, a cultural innovator, a ruler who had transformed Roman civilization through the power of beauty and performance. Instead, he is remembered as the emperor who fiddled while Rome burned, who killed his own mother, who turned the Roman Empire into his personal theater of cruelty. The irony is that Nero's greatest performance was not any song he sang or play he acted in, but the spectacle of his own reign. For 14 years, he held the attention of the known world through a combination of charisma, terror, and sheer unpredictability. People couldn't look away, even when they desperately wanted to, because no one could predict what he might do next. In the end, that might be Nero's most enduring legacy, the demonstration that absolute power, combined with unlimited ego and artistic pretension, creates a form of evil that is both terrifying and absurd, both monstrous and pathetic. He showed the world what happens when a society allows one person's personal fantasies to become everyone else's nightmare. The emperor's final bow, as we reach the end of our journey through Nero's blood-soaked reign. It's worth asking what this story tells us about power, about human nature, and about the thin line between civilization and chaos. Nero wasn't born a monster. He was created by a system that gave unlimited authority to someone whose only qualifications were his family connections and his mother's murderous ambition. The Roman Empire survived Nero's death, but it never fully recovered from the damage he inflicted. The Julio-Claudian dynasty ended with him, and the empire that emerged from the civil wars that followed was fundamentally different from the one Augustus had created. The idea that an emperor could be a moral leader, a philosopher king who ruled through virtue rather than force, died with the men Nero executed. Future emperors would be judged primarily by their military effectiveness and political competence, not by their character or cultural contributions. But, perhaps most importantly, Nero's reign demonstrated the danger of treating governance as entertainment. The emperor who turned politics into theater, who made spectacle more important than substance, who valued applause more than effective administration, created a template that has been followed by would-be tyrants throughout history. The techniques he pioneered, using propaganda to manipulate public opinion, creating elaborate distractions to hide policy failures, eliminating critics through legal persecution, and maintaining power through a combination of fear and spectacle, have been refined and perfected by dictators in every era since. The man who claimed to be an artist left behind no lasting works of art. His poems have been lost, his songs forgotten, his theatrical performances remembered only as examples of imperial excess. But his techniques of control, his methods of manipulation, his understanding of how to use fear and spectacle to maintain power, these have proven to be his most enduring creative achievements. Today, when we see leaders who seem more interested in their public image than their actual responsibilities, who treat serious issues as opportunities for dramatic performance, who view criticism as treason and disagreement as disloyalty, we are witnessing the continuing influence of Nero's legacy. The emperor who died unmourned and unremembered has become one of history's most successful teachers, even though the lessons he taught were ones no decent society should ever want to learn. The greatest tragedy of Nero's reign was not any single act of cruelty, not even the murder of his mother or the persecution of Christians. It was the systematic destruction of the idea that power should be exercised with restraint, that leadership requires moral authority as well as political control, and that the people who rule us should be held to higher standards rather than exempted from normal human decency. Nero wanted to be remembered as the greatest artist who ever lived. Instead, he became history's most successful demonstration of how absolute power corrupts absolutely, and how the combination of unlimited authority and unlimited ego creates monsters that threaten not just their immediate victims, but the entire structure of civilized society. Perhaps that's the most fitting end to his story. The man who spent his life performing for audiences, who craved applause and adoration above all else, who believed that his artistic vision justified any amount of human suffering, has achieved a form of immortality through infamy. Every time someone uses his name as a synonym for tyranny, every time his story is told as a cautionary tale, every time we remember the horror of his reign, Nero gets exactly what he always wanted: an audience that can't look away. The curtain has fallen, the applause has died away, and the theater is empty. But the performance continues, because some shows are too terrible to be forgotten, and some performers too dangerous to be forgiven. In the end, Nero got his wish for immortality, just not in the way he expected. Good night, and remember, unlike Emperor Nero, I actually want you to enjoy the show.